When I was coming of age in the 1970s, all my friends were reading Tolkien. I read some of his books too, and I went on to read some other fantasy books. I still have a soft spot for the Dragon Riders of Pern and Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea series, but probably not enough that I'd reread them now. Reading those books just confirmed what I was already feeling, that there was something else I should be reading. I suspected that it might be whatever was in those books I'd seen behind the wizard Merlin when my dad took me to see the Sword in the Stone when I was 8. The trouble was that I lacked a vocabulary to describe what I was looking for. I read some Arthurian stuff, but it felt like a dead end. I think one or two friends mentioned the Mabinogion to me, but at the time I had no idea that the Mabinogion wasn't just another fantasy series. It was both difficult and embarrassing to articulate what I was looking for, because I wasn't just looking for something to read, I was looking for the old gods of Britain and Ireland, but I didn't know whether they were findable. And if that sounds a little incredible, remember it was the 1970s, there was no internet yet, and I lived in a small town with small town libraries. In the early 1980s, I relocated to the capital of Scotland, where better libraries prevailed, and I was on my way. I read a few books on archaeology, I started reading Celtic mythology, and then I just started reaching out to deities with offerings, with my attention. I did that for many years, and when I'd meet the occasional pagan in my travels, I usually sensed they weren't quite on the same page somehow. I didn't give it too much thought. What I was doing with the gods was a constant in my life, but it wasn't particularly central yet. By that time, I had already kind of rejected popular culture. I rarely watched TV or listened to pop music. I immersed myself in various kinds of traditional music. That was my profession, and I was generally a bit of a hippie. I still am. I liked what I was doing for a living. I liked being outdoors. I liked reading old Celtic texts and trying to commune with the gods. So that was my journey into Celtic polytheism, but it wasn't most people's, I guess. A lot of popular things passed me by. I remember people mentioning Dungeons and Dragons and had it explained to me and decided to give it a miss. And whatever people were doing with computer games a little later was also a mystery. Still is. I've never played one. I just prefer real life. In 2009, I returned to the US, which coincided with the rise of Facebook. And this meant that I could keep in touch with my UK friends. But I also suddenly started bumping into other Celtic polytheists. And one topic that sometimes came up was fantasy, whether this was novels or films or online games. Now, from living in Scotland and playing traditional music, I was already aware of the issue of Celtic cultures being trivialized and misrepresented. I was surprised that when I spoke up about this with reference to some aspects of popular fantasy, people in the Celtic polytheist in-crowd were quite quick to shut me down. Their argument was, oh, well, that's how a lot of people first got interested in Celtic reconstructionism. Of course, they're right. It still appears to be the case today, and I wonder whether it's entirely healthy. But first, a little history. So I might be the right age, but I'm not one of the founders of Celtic paganism as a movement. A little research about its founders reveals something interesting. A lot of them were fairly entangled with the fantasy genre, one way or another. So these are just a few examples, pretty random examples. Erin Rowan Lowry wrote a well-known book on Ogham and a popular piece about the Cauldron of Poesy text. In this interview in 2015, she mentions being a fan of science fiction and fantasy. Alexei Kondratiev was a polymath with interests in linguistics, anthropology, Celtic languages, and ultimately in Celtic paganism. He's often cited as an important early influence in US Celtic paganism. In this 1993 interview, he attributed his gradual attraction to neo-paganism in the 1980s this way. I actually discovered paganism from science fiction fandom. I read and write science fiction and fantasy. I discovered that a lot of fans were starting to become neo-pagans. I realized that many of them were really atheists who were bored with the traditional atheism because it was simply not fun. Isaac Bonowitz was a founder of the American Reconstructionist ADF group and a regular presenter at neo-pagan conferences and festivals all over the US, as well as regularly attending gaming conventions in the Bay Area to promote one of his books. And of course, several respected authors of nonfiction books on Celtic paganism also write in the fantasy genre, such as Morgan Daimler. I'm not trying to tut-tut at the unseriousness of any of the people I've mentioned. I'm just illustrating the point that there is a significant crossover between an interest in fantasy and many of the thought leaders in Celtic polytheism. One of the foundational aspects of all fantasy is world building. You have to decide how your fantasy world works, what languages are spoken, and what the weather's like, and do people have magical powers? This naturally appeals to smart people with specialist interests like linguistics, ancient cultures, or mythology. It's no wonder that reconstructing ancient Celtic religions appeals to the same group of people. If you enjoy my videos, you might like to join one of my online classes. Some classes have tiered pay-what-you-can pricing, and there are often scholarships available for the more expensive classes. To hear about these when they're announced, you can go to my website and subscribe to my newsletter, or follow me on my Patreon page. The vast majority of Celtic reconstructionists are in North America. Not that that makes them wrong or bad, it's just a statistic. It's really, really tough living in one place, yet feeling this heart-rending, gut-wrenching pull to another place. For a lot of people, this is connected to their perceived ancestry. For others, it's just a feeling, but it's no less real. The pain is real. But while it is real, the perceptions about the place or the culture you want to return to or honor or participate in are often far from accurate. I'll mostly use Scotland as an example because it's what I know best, but you could certainly apply this to Wales or Ireland and beyond. First, people's longing is often rooted in the past, in Romanticism and media representations. People tend to imagine Scotland through the lens of Brigadoon, Braveheart, Outlander, folks skipping through the heather in their clan tartans. Or maybe they try to imagine what the Picts were like, and they go get some blue tattoos. Or maybe they're fascinated by the poetic folk practices found in the Carmina Gadelica, or they get interested in fairies. If they visit Scotland, they often gravitate to romantic castles or pre-Celtic standing stones. And if you like some of those things, that's fine. But it might just be connecting you to fantasy, not to real culture, and certainly not to the gods. I think this problem is inherent in trying to connect worship of the gods to how we feel about culture we've lost touch with, maybe had taken away from us. Of course, fantasy fiction is for entertainment, while dealing with the gods is more serious. For me, it's all about the gods. I don't need a lot more, but for some people, the cultural package is important. They enjoy using words from a language they don't necessarily speak and creating elaborate calendars and rituals. And if you're working in a group, then the establishment of group traditions is a good thing. Going on reinventing rituals year after year, it's a waste of energy. On the other hand, a couple of people getting together and creating lots of protocols because they have a vision is not the establishment of traditions. It's more like world building. It's artificial. Traditions happen because something has been working, and traditions last when they continue to work, which means that they're alive and responsive to the moment. We don't really know what worked in the past for people who worshipped Celtic deities. We only know a little about what was done here and there at different moments. We know even less about whether it was satisfying or sustainable. We only know that there were forces that it ultimately couldn't withstand. The rise of the Roman Empire, which kind of morphed into the rise of Christianity, the rise of modernism, and finally the loss of belief in anything that can't be scientifically proven. And here we are. The gods seem to have reasserted themselves, or at least responded to those who've called on them in the past few decades. And maybe we should put the gods at the center for now, and just let traditions happen over time. I love Scottish culture, and I love that broader, less tangible Celtic culture, but we're now in a situation where most of the people who feel drawn to that globally haven't experienced it at a significant level. I acknowledge this as a deep psychic wound for people, but in a way, I see that as separate from our interaction with the gods. I don't interact with the gods in an attempt to recreate the behavior of my Celtic ancestors. I interact with them because I believe the gods are worthy of honor, because I believe they offer me help, and because the gods show signs of appreciating our attention. I don't think Celtic deities are all powerful or all knowing, but they're smart enough to know that people reaching out to them now live in this crazy era we call the 21st century. They can see that we live all over the globe, speak a variety of new languages, and lack connections to the people who honored them thousands of years ago. I don't think we have to interact with them through the medium of culture. This doesn't mean I don't care about culture and tradition. I've dedicated most of my life to it one way or another. I think it's vitally important for Celtic pagans to know and preserve the lore surrounding our gods. That's why I teach mythology. And I'd like to see more of us familiar with the poetry and history and laws. These things tell us so much about what people once valued. I hope the rest will follow in time, but it won't look like the past.